Good morning, US. Good morning, Europe. I'm glad to welcome another exceptional speaker to our module, Emerging Fields in Architecture. Very happy, very glad that Brent Sherwood is with us for today. Brent Sherwood is a space architect with 32 years of professional experience in the space industry. And he is also the Vice President, Advanced Development Programs for Blue Origin. He and his team at Blue Origin currently develop in space vehicles and systems, including the lunar human landing system and advanced concept and technologies. Prior to Blue Origin, Brent was at the NASA JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, for 14 years. There he worked as program manager for planetary mission formulation. He led strategy and formulation for JPL planetary science missions. And even before, Brent was at Boeing for 70 years, leading concept engineering for human planetary exploration, manufacturing engineering for the International Space Station module integration. Interesting about Brent is also that he has a multidisciplinary background. He holds a BA in liberal arts from Yale, a Master of Architecture from the Yale School of Architecture, and a Master of Science in Aerospace Engineering from the University of Maryland. Over the years, he has published and presented over 15 papers on space exploration, development, and settlement of space. I think from which you will hear a little bit now in his presentation. He also published a book from whom he was the editor. The book is called Out of This World, the New Field of Space Architecture. And until this year, Brent Sherwood was the chair of the Space Architecture Technical Committee of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. Also this year, he was awarded the Columbia Medal by the American Society of Civil Engineers. Thank you very much, Brent Sherwood. Thank you for joining our class. I'm really very glad that you took the time. You must be very busy, and I'm looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sandra. Can you hear?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. It's actually, it's a delight to be here, partly because Sandra is such a friend, but also because the programs that she has led at the university for many, many years have been really leading proponents of space architecture and have yielded many, many examples, well, both graduates, but also examples of what it means to think about space systems from an architect standpoint and actually do space architecture. So most of what we have been promoting in this new field and what we wrote about in our book and what Sandra has written about in her books really is about why the architectural way of thinking is critical for a real future for humans in space. I'll just say a couple of things before we get started into the material about our philosophy of space architecture, and that is that there's a progression in all fields. New fields arise in the intersection between traditional fields. And that's what we've been doing for a few decades with space architecture. Architects focus on the built environment and creating environments for human activity that embody the functions that societies need to perform, but as well the aspirations that societies have. And so it's about remaking the environment around our activities and dreams. That's what architecture is on Earth, and that's what it will be in space. So far in space, practically everything has been designed by engineering teams. And that's reasonable in the early days of space flight because space is such a hostile, in fact, lethal environment. I like to say death is just on the other side of the wall. in space. And spaceflight is hard, very uh, uh, high energies, very high speeds. Things can go wrong instantaneously. And so it's kind of reasonable that even human space flight systems will have been designed by engineers as we're all still learning together how to make these things function. However, for the vision that many of us are pursuing, that is larger and larger numbers of people operating in space, and eventually living there and raising families there, um, we will get to a point where the atavistic needs of human societies, that is the needs that humans have psychologically and sociologically, will become dominant in the way we design environments for human activity in space. We will have learned how to deal with the engineering challenges. And a way you can see this is in the contrast between depictions in science fiction films and spaceflight technology today. So typically in realistic science fiction films, you'll see things that we're familiar with, like airlocks and spacesuits and space systems docking and rendezvousing and all those kinds of things. But it all happens very fast in space, and it all happens in a way that, I mean, in movies, and it happens in a way which makes it seem like this is just, opening the door of your flat and walking out into the world, or getting in your car and driving around. And real space flight today is not yet like that, but it will get like that as we learn how systems function and how the space environment interacts with systems. We will solve all those problems, and then, just like on Earth, the engineers will end up working for the architects, and that's how we will know that we've arrived really as a field, because we'll be focused on the needs of work teams and passengers and tourists and industrialists and all those other activities that are essential for the scale of our vision. So a few of us several decades ago kind of, I don't want to say intuited that, but maybe were driven to try to push the world in that direction, and started working to create this field of space architecture. We eventually all found each other, a few in the US and then a few in Europe, Russia, Japan. And then over the years, we've created these networks in which we communicate and share ideas and learning with each other. We sponsor sessions at 3 major conferences each year. That's been going on for several years, and we've been publishing books, as Sandra mentioned. And so this is kind of the beginning of normalizing this idea that architecture in space is an important part of our future. Those of you who are students of space architecture, I applaud you, and I wish you, well in your careers. It's a tough business because a lot of times engineering teams are still focused on the safety and just the simple mechanics of space flight. And also, we find that in the architecture realm, folks who self-describe as space architects are viewed as somewhat odd, because they're not building buildings, they're building view graphs and writing papers and building models and things. And that's okay. That will all resolve over time. It takes courage to strike out into this new field of space architecture, and people have done it in many ways. A few have really made a career out of space architecture. Most others, like me, have found a succession of other positions and jobs, and really pursued our love for space architecture in our free time. I've been really fortunate in my own career that I was able to get to a place where now I can bring the two together in both what I'm able to do for Blue Origin and leading our teams, and to continue to promote the field that way. So most of what I'll be talking about today comes from my own writings in the past as a space architect. I will show just a little bit about what Blue Origin is working on today, because it's very relevant and exciting for this topic, I think. And then we'll have some questions or time for discussion. So with that, I'll begin into the content. Let me minimize this up here. Okay. So I call this 4 futures for human spaceflight. And you'll see a few slides in why that is. It's really the pivotal concept for how I view the ways that we can invest and the technologies that we can develop and the kind of systems we can field in your working lifetime. And the fundamental message is it's really important to know where you're trying to go conceptually, because otherwise you're random walking through the universe. And that's not what architects do. We do things with intention. So it's really important to be clear about our intentions. I'm going to begin with, oops, let's see how to advance. Yeah, I'm going to begin with the takeaway, and then we can loop back to this. What I'd like you to remember from today are these 4 things. And they seem simple, but you'll see as I go through the material why it's important to be explicit about them. First is that we, you, all of us, have choices about how to use space in the 21st century. Most of what happens in space are activities or priorities that are handed to us by governments primarily. And many factors go into the decision-making that leads to those priorities. And sometimes, well, often it's easy to lose sight of the core drivers for why we would be there in the first place. But I believe it's very important that we be clear about those things. And I'll show you how stark contrasts arise based on different assumptions. Second is that the rate of growth of activity in space will be controlled by capital markets. And the reason for that is that the investment that governments are able to make in spaceflight is pretty well bounded. We understand what the budgets for space agencies around the world are. With few exceptions, the sizes of those budgets relative to their respective nations' gross national product is not going to change. It'll be about what it's been, so that you can linearly extrapolate into the future the amount of spaceflight activity that will be able to be purchased by governments. That's a really important point. You can look at the past to project the future. And if you look at the past and then project into the future, you will not achieve the rate of growth that enables the kind of vision that we commonly talk about, that we design as space architects, that we see in even paintings that aerospace companies and agencies put out. There's a mismatch between what we can accomplish with budgets today and the vision that we try to show people that we're aiming for in the future. That gap can only be closed by resources from outside the context of government-funded programs. And that means capital markets. Accessing money in capital markets requires generating commercial value. And so we'll talk about what that means. Yet, because spaceflight is very hard, the technologies necessary to do things in space are funded by governments. And that's what I call the enabling technology. So the government investments, albeit not large enough to grow to the vision that we share, are the ones that shape the content of what we're able to do. And what that means is it's critically important to be able to direct or focus the government technology investments in ways that allow us in turn to access capital markets by generating commercial value. You must have the two together in order to get to a broad and inspiring future. And out of all of this, in fact, I would argue that China is the only space power that's genuinely investing in a growth future. That sounds like an incendiary statement, and I'll show you later specifically what I mean by that. It's in one particular area which has enormous growth potential, distinct from the kinds of planetary exploration that we typically see described. So these are the 4 points that I'd like you eventually to remember from today's discussion. We do have choices about how we use space. Growing to the vision requires generating commercial value and accessing money outside of government budgets. Government budgets are the ones that generate the technology that we need to do all of these activities. And there is a nation on Earth today that is aiming at a growth future in space. Okay. All right. So first, I want to provide some context for the domains of human spaceflight. And I'm gonna start this discussion with the way most organizations and enterprises tend to think about humans in space, and that is a destination-centric view. So at the top here, you see Earth, Moon, and Mars. And these are the most common destinations for human spaceflight that are discussed for decades now, really the half century ever since Apollo. There's been a debate, which is what in America, we would call it a tempest in a teapot. That is a fierce debate that actually doesn't make much difference between the Moon and Mars. And we'll talk a little bit about the distinction between the Moon and Mars. But what's fascinating to me is that the entire discussion is destination oriented. It's about the Moon versus Mars and planetary destinations versus Earth orbit. What it doesn't do is address why we care to be in any of these places and the implications of focusing our resources to operate in those places. So that's what this chart is going to walk us through. And I do it in terms of the technical challenge and risk and how that translates into the need for resources. So I would argue that today we are able to operate in low Earth orbit, and the International Space Station, as you just saw last week, passed its 20th anniversary of continuous occupancy. So the most amazing machine yet developed by humanity's technology and done collaboratively internationally, really a tremendous example of what can be done with peacetime efforts, is orbiting Earth very, very close to Earth. So close to Earth that it's in the upper reaches of the atmosphere and needs to be reboosted constantly to stay in orbit. This is really the domain in which we understand human spaceflight operations. The amount of learning that we've gotten from the space station program over the past, I would say, 3 decades or 3.5, the development phase, and then the launch, deployment, and assembly phase, and now the operations and utilization phase. That set of learning is incomparable, and it provides us a good foundation, but not a complete foundation for what we need to be doing in the future. But this yellow region here on this map is where we're operating today. If you want to go anywhere else, the first thing you have to deal with is space radiation. And that applies everywhere outside of Earth orbit. So as soon as you get above the Van Allen belts and you get out of the geomagnetic field, you are now exposed to high energy protons from solar flares. And without the column density of Earth's atmosphere, the way we have standing on Earth's surface, we are exposed to galactic cosmic rays. And both of those require shielding and other mitigations. It doesn't matter where you go beyond Earth, even starting in geo, there's a harsh radiation environment, and that occurs everywhere in space. The next thing to think about is remote operations. So If you're operating out at the geostationary orbit, it's hard to get to, which is why for decades now, it's been easier to replace satellites than it has been to repair them or refuel them, because they're far away. The geo orbit requires a lot of propulsion and to get out there, and then remote operations as well. This, I would say, extends throughout cislunar space. That's the region of space subtended by the Earth-Moon gravitational system. So all the Earth-Moon Lagrange points are in this region of space. So if you're going to operate with humans in these places, you need to address the reality that help is not immediate, and there's a need for robotic and teleoperated assistance. And then doing EVAs in these remote environments is even more challenging than doing them very close to Earth for those reasons. There were a few EVAs done in lunar orbit by Apollo missions, but so far that's it. All other EVAs have been done in low Earth orbit. The next thing to think about is what it means to operate in deep space. So here I include the Sun-Earth Lagrange points, the Sun-Mars Lagrange points. So these are the gravitational domains of the Earth and Mars in relationship to the Sun, and near-Earth asteroids as well. Near-Earth asteroids or near-Earth objects in general are objects which are in orbits more or less similar to Earth's orbit, maybe a little smaller, maybe a little bigger, sometimes crossing Earth's orbit. And so what that means is they're easy to get to in terms of delta V, but they're hard to get to because they require long trip times. So this is really the key aspect of this purple region in deep space. It means you are on long trips, you're very far from home, help is not even physically possible. So the kind of self-sufficiency that's required is far in excess of what we would find even in cislunar space. When you're on one of these missions, you are out there for months to years. And that imposes all kinds of requirements on human systems and the supporting systems that are just unlike what we find in cislunar space. If you want to get near a planet, the moon or Mars, now in addition, you need large propulsion systems, and I'll show you examples later. So this means if you want to be in orbit around the moon or in orbit around Mars, or if you want to go to the moons of Mars, you need all these things, for radiation protection and remote operations and deep space operations, and you need very large propulsion stages to get there, to capture into orbit, to get back out of orbit, to come home, and then to take all that energy out when you get back to Earth. And then finally, if you want to operate on the surfaces of planets, you need capabilities to be able to get down from orbit, to get back up to orbit from the surface, and then a whole host of surface operations capabilities and systems to operate in those remote, hostile, dusty, difficult, challenging, exploratory environments. So here's the irony in this map. There are very useful human activities in every one of these locations. And we could have conversations in Q&A about what they might be. Why humans would want to go to Sun-Earth L2, for example, or what's special about Sun-Earth L1, or the L4 and L5 points, or why would we care about going to near-Earth asteroids? Why would we care about the moons of Mars? We can talk about all those things. They're all valid destinations for human spaceflight activity, yet the ones that are the big battle in the community, the moon and Mars, are in fact the hardest out of all of them on this map. And that challenge, that difficulty, particularly in the case of Mars, has not been part of the conversation. Yet, this is why we haven't gotten to Mars yet. So in my career, I have watched us not go to Mars 3 separate times. And the reason ultimately is because retiring the technical challenges to make human spaceflight to Mars happen, no matter what anybody says, is a very tall order. A few years ago, I was on a NASA planning team that was in around 2009 or 10. And we rendered down the list of necessary technologies for a first mission to Mars using NASA's design reference mission architectures at the time. And the list had over 60 critical technologies, none of which exist today, and all of which are required for the very first mission. So this is why aspirations of humans to Mars has been so elusive, very expensive and very hard. And the available budgets from all the governments of spacefaring nations put together aren't enough to make progress on the schedule that people want progress to be made on. So Mars remains a very hard challenge. In most cases now in today's world, the nations have settled on working together for lunar activities, a decision I applaud because as hard as planetary destinations are, the moon is orders of magnitude simpler than Mars. And so if we're going to learn how to operate in deep space and put people in harm's way for months at a time remotely, we need to learn how to do that in a place that's only a few days away instead of a place that's 8 months away. So this kind of gives you an overview of a couple of points. There are useful things for humans to do in all of these locations in space. They're not all equally hard. And the one that seems to be the most persistent dream, both within and without the community, is the hardest of all. Okay, so now I want to lay out what I call the Four Futures vision. And it's very straightforward, but I think it's a very powerful model to think about human spaceflight. And what I'll tell you is that in a half century of reading a lot about space flight and what we would like to do and what we can do, and then in over 3 decades of working in the field, I have yet to come across a single idea for human space flight that doesn't arise out of one of these 4 visions. So that's powerful because it's like a compass. It tells you where somebody's coming from as soon as they start talking to you about what they want to do or what they think is the most important or what's the most critical technology. Immediately you can map it into this space of the 4 futures, and then it will orient you to what their most important concerns and priorities are. So very simple and very distinct. In the upper left, you see exploration. And I use a historic painting of Lewis and Clark because most space exploration, certainly human space exploration, is primarily funded and promoted by the US government. And the US government views exploration in this way. Lewis and Clark were commissioned by President Thomas Jefferson after the Louisiana Purchase to quote unquote explore all the region of territory that the United States had just purchased from France. Of course, we know today that that did not mean seeing places that no one had ever seen, which is kind of implied by this painting, because there were people already living there. There were long-standing civilizations of native populations in the United States and or in those Western territories, and United States exploration just ran over all of that, absorbed it into the growing United States, and then contained those native populations ultimately in reservations that were where treaties were pushed upon those people. So that's a challenging history sociologically. Other nations around the world have similar histories. Australia is another example. But it's important to appreciate that the model that is endemic to the American vision of exploring space is this model. It's new territory. It's a place that we haven't been, we haven't seen it. We want to go over the next hill and discover what's there. And so if you're about exploring, it's important to realize that good exploring means going someplace you've never been, which is why you hear people dismiss the moon as been there, done that, because 6 human crews have been in a few isolated spots on the near side in the mid latitudes. And so if you're all about exploring, doing more in a location like that, even if it's a very different location like the polar regions or the far side or places that we now know on the moon have very interesting phenomenology that needs to be studied, that feels like it's not really exploring. And so this is, I think, fundamental to why people believe that after Apollo, the next thing we need to do is go to Mars, because Mars is the farthest away we could imagine getting. It's genuinely new territory. Humans have never set foot there. And so that checks all the boxes for goodness in the exploration vision. Yet, as I described a few minutes ago, we know what the NASA budget can buy. $23 billion a year. I call that 10 to the 10th dollars per year. We know what it can afford and we know what it can't afford. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on a subsequent chart. It is unrealistic to imagine that that same level of budget will be able to do fantastic things on Mars when Mars costs orders of magnitude more than what we're able to do today. All the money that we spend today on space exploration is being spent, right? It's supporting space station, it's getting crews up and back, it's operating station, it's doing microgravity research on station. It's not like the money's being wasted. And now if we need to do that plus go explore some other place, where does the money come from? So exploration is noble, it's inspiring, it has all kinds of importance for human society, yet it costs a lot of money and no one other than governments is going to pay the money to make it happen. That's really, really key to understand. Let's talk about the two quadrants in the lower left and upper right. The lower left I call experience, and I like to use a cruise ship. Even in the COVID environment, I believe we will get back to terrestrial exploration and or experiencing places that people have explored. And the essence of this is that you and I can go. We can save up our resources, we can buy a ticket, we can go on a trip, and we can go to a place that's hostile, remote, stunning, inspiring, and novel, and it enriches us. It gives us stories, it gives us images, it gives us memories. And this is why there is a very large adventure travel and even larger tourism industry terrestrially. A hiccup because of COVID now. Once the world works its way through that, we will get back to traveling. Experiencing space is fundamentally different from exploring space. If you're exploring space, you want to go as far away as you can, okay? And maybe that means at the end of the day, meaning 3 decades later, you will have 6 civil servants standing on Mars. Experiencing space is very different. It means taking large numbers of ordinary people into space experiences. So you can think about traveling just a short distance up into low Earth orbit to an orbital resort hotel, for example. We already understand most of the technology required for that. It's like a cousin of the International Space Station. So we know how to make it safe and operable and have windows and provide volumes for people to experience microgravity and so forth. And so think about this as an adventure travel experience. The ride of your life, 8 minutes up, 45 minutes back down. The experience of, experiencing microgravity, which is something that cannot be duplicated in any theme park on Earth. You can only replicate it for a few seconds at a time in airplane flights, or a couple of minutes at a time in our New Shepard rocket. But if you want sustained microgravity experiences where you get to tumble and flip around and play with your food and have zero-G sex and do those kinds of experiencing that environment, you need to be in orbit to do it. And then finally, the view out the window is the most poignant, meaningful, beautiful, ever-changing view in the solar system. You're looking at Earth without borders. You're seeing the effects of environmental devastation in river runoff and other things. You can see the wakes of ships in the ocean. Astronauts never tire of looking out the window, and neither will travelers. So the experience is eminently marketable. And the difference here is that this is tapping eventually mass markets, not government budgets. So rather than $23 billion a year, which is what NASA spends on everything, including human spaceflight, there is a much higher limit to what people are willing to spend on travel and tourism. So this is an example of how we can break out of the government budget constraint to access markets, customers, and capital beyond government investments. But the only way to do it is to give those customers an experience. And that requires types of technology and operating in destinations that are fundamentally different from what are required to explore. The one in the upper right is explicitly about extracting value from the space environment. What does that mean? There are sort of three fundamental ways to do that. One is to take advantage of position or location, unique locations in space. The classic examples, the geostationary orbits, which have been monetized for Earth remote sensing and telecommunications for many years. The geo orbit and other orbits could be monetized for collection of solar energy and transmittal to the surface of the Earth, for a sustainable, more green way of providing or meeting the growing needs of energy on the surface of the Earth. We are not doing that today, but we could. We understand all those technologies. Locations in space are also useful from a defense standpoint. So, for example, today, there are a lot of discussions about operating and maneuvering within the volume of cislunar space. Why? That's because you can approach the geo orbits and other orbits from very high up. And that's important for the astrodynamics of plane change, the energetics of plane change, and it enables maneuverability, intercession, observation, interdiction, and ultimately all of those things will be required to protect assets in space. So for example, if you imagine systems to support the experience economy from the lower left, who's going to provide the policing and security functions, and how is that done? Well, that needs to be done by capabilities that are using unique attributes of locations and orbits in space, and that's in the upper right. And then finally, the one that people tend to think about, although it's the farthest into the future, is the potential for extracting value from material resources on the moon and on asteroids. It's well known that among the near-Earth asteroids are all of the essential elements required for human industrial activity. That is volatiles, including water, molecule or atoms that are elements that are rare on the moon, like carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, all of which are required for biomass and sustaining habitable systems. Okay, those are all available in the asteroids, and then metals are available in a few asteroids as well. So everything that we need for civilization and industrialization, we can find in the asteroids. We can find a lot of it on the moon, and the moon is a lot closer than asteroids and is a great place to start learning how to extract value from the materials we find in space. But these as well, if you can find something or make something that adds value into the terrestrial economy, then you can access capital outside of government investment budgets. So these two quadrants, lower left and upper right, are the way to break out of the constraint of government exploration budgets. And doing that is required if we're ever going to get to the scale of activity that enables the lower right quadrant, which is expanding human civilization into space. So, at Blue Origin, our vision is stated very crisply as enabling millions of people to live and work in space to benefit the Earth. Millions of people living and working in space means amazing places for them to live and work, and amazing work for them to be doing. But it also means having normal society there. That means people able to go through their life cycle, their career, their young years, their careers, their old years, raising families, and having all of the attributes of society that architects worry about here on Earth. Well, really doing that in space is about expanding our presence into the solar system, and that can only occur using space resources in the upper right, and introducing spaceflight to large numbers of people, which is the lower left. So the reason this framework is important is when you get into discussions with government sponsors or people who are promoting individual technologies or potential customers or people who don't know or care anything about space, it's important to know what conversation you're having and what you're aiming at. Do you want, for example, to have, are you aiming for a world in which there are hundreds or thousands of people raising families on the moon? Or are you aiming at a future in which we are providing clean, unlimited energy to Earth? Or do you want a future in which hundreds of thousands of ordinary people are flying in Earth orbit every year? Or do you want a future in which 6 civil servants stand on Mars someday? All of them are important. All of them are worthy, but they're very different, and the technologies to enable them are different. So it's important to know what you're investing in and why. I want to say a little bit about the constraints of government budgets here. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a reductionist argument, but it helps, I think, to clarify the reality. On the left, you see the International Space Station. I worked on it for a few years in Phase C when I was doing manufacturing engineering. I call it learning how to build the ship in the bottle. That is integrating the distributed systems into the modules that Boeing was developing for the space station. Tremendously hard program, really a glorious achievement of international collaboration. And it'll be a long time before we're able to do anything remotely comparable to this. It took a long time to develop, much longer than people thought it was going to take. It cost more than people thought it was going to cost. And it took a lot of particularly international negotiations and learning to work together to make this project happen. But it's an amazing achievement. But I will argue for this purpose, all it is 4 things. It's some way of getting up and back. I put shuttle in quotation marks because in the old days, it was a shuttle, space shuttle, and Soyuz. Now it's also Crew Dragon. Soon it will also be Starliner. Eventually it may hopefully be a human version of Dreamliner from Sierra Nevada and others. So there is now multiple ways to shuttle up to station and back down. Okay, but you have to have that. And then the rest of station is a big power system, which really dominates this view, and an associated thermal system, which also dominates this view, laboratories and habitats. And I differentiate between those two, even though the fundamental technologies are the same, because their purposes and their outfitting are so different. So if you have these 4 things, you have a space station. Well, getting those 4 things consumed most of the resources of the spacefaring nations for decades. And is mostly still consuming the resources of those agencies to operate and use it. Now let's imagine we're going to the moon over on the right-hand side. Well, you still need some kind of way of getting up and down from Earth. You need some kind of power system. And depending on where you are on the moon, that power system has multiple complex components like power storage, power leveling. Collecting solar energy at the poles is very different from doing it in the mid-latitudes where you have a 2-week night. Some people talk about nuclear power. This is tough, not been developed yet, requires a lot of shielding for people to operate around it. But you need a power system. You need laboratories because you're going to be doing scientific exploration. You're going to be doing sample analyses and, geology and biology experiments and so forth. You need habitats. And in fact, on the moon, they're not just habitats. They need to be shielded from radiation, as we discussed before. So you need all those same things, the lunar version of all those same things that we had on the left for station. But you'll also need a way to get to and from the moon. You need a way to get down onto the moon and back up on 2 other kinds of shuttles. You need a lot of surface infrastructure for moving around and doing construction. And you need to be able to start using lunar resources, all of which are depicted in this painting here. And so kind of the message is, if all of the resources we have access to are already consumed by getting the thing on the left, nobody should imagine that getting the thing on the right is going to be even as inexpensive. It will not. To get to that picture on the right will cost more than it took the nations of the Earth to get to the picture on the left. So we really have to be very clear-eyed about the rate of progress that we're able to make, what is most important to do first, and how we can somehow get the costs down. So, so there is some promising work happening. For example, the first bullet, the up-down shuttle, now we know that the cost of getting into space is able to be reduced by reusable systems. SpaceX has shown that first. We now are, with government investment, developing a moon return shuttle. That's the Orion capsule that flies on SLS. Now, with the human landing system development, we are, again, with government resources, developing the lander and ascent shuttle. So we're gradually getting the pieces that could be put in place. But getting all of this will not come fast, and it will not be cheap. Ultimately, it will cost more than what space station cost. It has to. And therefore, the international collaboration is even more essential than it was for space station. It's going to take all of our efforts together to make any vision like the one you see on the right come to pass. Okay, I want to say a little bit about that moon up and down shuttle. And so what you see here is the human landing system design that Blue Origin's national team is developing for NASA as we speak. So I'll talk a little bit about the system to just describe it. You see a descent stage with the landing gear on the left. This is a cryogenic stage, so it's hydrogen oxygen stage. And so this is essentially like the descent module of the lunar module, or the descent stage of the lunar module in Apollo, except with modern technologies and much higher performing systems because it uses cryogenic propellant. Sitting on top is what we call the ascent element. That's like the ascent stage of the Apollo lunar module. This current version is based on storable propellants. They give you very predictable, high reliability start and so forth. And this system, just like on Apollo, has a couple of really amazing requirements it has to meet. So first of all, it carries the crew. It's got the crew cab on top. In the initial mission, it will carry 2 crew, and then in subsequent missions, it will carry 4 crew. But on the way down, while the descent stage is doing what it's doing, the ascent stage has to be ready at an instant's notice to punch out and perform an abort back to orbit. That's what we call anytime abort. And that's done so that if anything goes wrong with the descent stage on the way down, the crew are able to get back up to where they were, which in this case is the Orion system that will take them back all the way to the surface of the Earth. So ascent stage and descent stage. The first mission that NASA has laid out is what they call a demonstration human landing in 2024. It literally only carries 2 crew and a little bit of science equipment. And it will be what I call a polar sortie mission, a quick mission with just a couple of EVAs, only lasting a few days on the surface total, into the polar regions, which we're now particularly interested in because of evidence of ice in some form, which eventually could be used as a resource. What for? For water, which means hydrogen and oxygen. So this whole system is designed to be able eventually to be reusable based on production of lunar propellants. In our case, it's a little bit hidden by the text at the bottom, but you see in the background another descent stage in the background, and one of the crewmen is heading over toward it. What that represents is our first test mission, which will be in 2023, just 3 years from now. That will test the descent stage and all of the guidance and navigation and the trajectory and so forth, soft landing, the self-leveling landing gear, all of those functions, so that we know that when we put the first NASA crew on in 2024, we will successfully get down to the surface. If you recall in Apollo, the Apollo 10 mission was a dress rehearsal for the first landing. And in that case, it was a crewed mission, and it separated the LEM from the command and service module in lunar orbit and descended toward the surface, but then it exercised that abort. It jettisoned the descent stage. The ascent stage aborted back up to, or came back up to a rendezvous with the command and service module. That was the design mission profile. It was done intentionally to test out the descent stage, the ascent stage, the separation, the lunar orbit rendezvous, and all of those things. And then it was successful. So then we proceeded with Apollo 11 to land. In this case, we're testing the descent stage in an uncrewed manner all the way down to the surface the year before the crewed mission goes down to the surface as well. After the first 1 or 2 crewed missions, then NASA's plan goes into what they call the sustainable missions, which include both human missions and cargo missions. And they'll be very different, right? So a human mission will have 4 crew and more payload. There'll be more capability, and there's some astrodynamics tricks that will play to help get to those missions quickly. The human crews will perform more EVAs and longer stays, and will also be able to go anywhere on the surface, not just to the poles, which is important for scientific exploration of about 24 sites around the globe of the moon that have been identified by the science community as highest priority for exploration. But then also versions of this without the ascent stage, but with cargo on top instead of the ascent stage, will be able to deliver large cargo systems like a 30-day habitat module, like a pressurized rover, which NASA has made a deal with the Japanese Space Agency to develop. Like in situ resource utilization experiments and pilot plants and so forth. So when we get to the sustainable missions later in the decade, then we'll be able to deliver the kinds of infrastructure, whatever the agencies have been able to afford to develop, we'll then be able to deliver those to the surface and start operating. Well, you remember the blue triangle on my destination map at the beginning. Getting close to these bodies with a lot of gravity costs a lot of propulsion. And in the case of the moon, It not only requires what you see here, which is like, as I said, the Apollo LEM, but because the mission architecture is different from Apollo, it needs more than just this. So Apollo did lunar orbit rendezvous in a low lunar orbit. So the propulsion to get into and out of that low lunar orbit was performed by the service module of the command and service module part of the Apollo stack. In our case, NASA's staging orbit for lunar exploration is called NRHO, a near rectilinear halo orbit. It's a highly elliptical orbit that is able to be moved around as a staging base for Lunar Gateway, which will be in NRHO. And the idea is to eventually use Gateway as the transportation node, not just for lunar missions, but eventually also as a staging location for departure for missions to Mars. That's the NASA vision, as we talked about. We're exploring, we're going to the moon to learn how to do what we need to do so that we can go to Mars. And so Gateway is in a very high orbit. So you can't just land on the surface from that orbit. You have to get from that orbit down to lunar orbit, then you can land. And so I'm going to show you on the next chart in a moment, but that drives two things. One is the ascent vehicle that you see here is bigger than the ascent vehicle that you remember from Apollo, because it's not coming back up to low lunar orbit. It's going all the way back up to NRHO. All right, so that's key. And then in addition, you need a big deorbit stage. So here you see the ascent element on the right, the descent element in the middle, and what we call the transfer element on the left. That is basically a big in-space propulsion stage, just like that blue triangle showed, to get us from high lunar orbit down into low lunar orbit and then send us on our way down to the surface. That stage is expended in this architecture. And then the rest of the stack does the mission that I described in the previous chart. So needing all of these elements to implement the NASA mission architecture is why we created what we call the national team. So Blue Origin's the prime contractor. Lockheed Martin, who is building the Orion space capsule for NASA for the Artemis program, is our partner for the ascent element. 60% of the systems in the ascent element are common with Orion, which is how we're able to make this all happen in on the time frame that NASA has laid out, 2024 for the human landing. Northrop Grumman provides the transfer element on the left. That's based largely on heritage from their Cygnus transportation system that provides cargo resupply flights to the International Space Station today. Very reliable, well understood system with some technology augmentations and sized correctly. It can then do this mission in deep space out at the moon as well. And then Draper is our partner for guidance and navigation. They were the ones who did guidance and nav for Apollo, so they know what they're doing with respect to landing on the moon. And they've actually provided guidance technology in every human spaceflight system that NASA has done since Apollo. So we believe that this team is able to get the job done in just a few short years. The team's been working tremendously well together and making an enormous amount of progress. We're halfway through what NASA calls the base period, which is just a 10-month phase A and phase B of the program. We're about to turn in our proposal for full-scale development, and NASA will make a down select decision in late winter, early spring. So by mid-spring this coming year, we should be off and running to actually develop the system, fly the test landing in 2023, and then the first human mission in 2024. The only other thing I'll say about those dates is I like to say that this program will go at the speed of appropriations. And by that, I mean, NASA can't make those dates happen unless it gets money from Congress. And presently, the amount of money that's been allocated by Congress through appropriations does not yet meet the spend profile required for those missions in 23 and 24. But we shall see how the political process works out in the United States and how the budgetary process follows. But in any case, whatever date is enabled by the funding, this team will be ready to deliver. Okay, now I want to come back to the world of space architecture and the four futures to kind of put it all in context for you and then wrap up. Typical of me, I'm going to be reductionist about this, and I'm going to suggest that everything that we have accomplished in the half century of human spaceflight so far is in those two items at the lower left of this map. What we see is a field in which at the bottom there's government investment and then blending into a world in which there's commercial investment at the top. So this is going to be another strategic map. What we did from the development of ballistic missiles in the 1950s, starting in the 40s and World War II, but then really in the 1950s and 60s, and the emergence of human spaceflight in 1961, and then development up through the space station program, really is what I call developing spaceflight. That means getting people into space, back out of space, successfully most of the time, understanding errors and flaws when they happen, and learning from them. But we do know how to put people in space, how to sustain them there, and how to do basic space operations. Then with a series of space stations, Skylab, Salyut, Mir, and now the International Space Station, and soon the new Chinese space station, we have been demonstrating space habitation. We've been learning how to operate there for sustained lengths of time. In the case of space station, as I said, 20 years uninterrupted. And so we're learning all those other things, how to keep the machine operating, how to do routine EVAs, and do servicing outside the vehicle as well as inside the vehicle, how to resupply, how to reboost, how to bring up new parts, how to make parts in space to replace broken parts. We're learning all of those things. It's been an enormous body of learning over the last 3 decades. But I would argue that everything we've done so far is those two items. Now what we're doing with the SLS and Orion and the Human Landing System and Gateway is we're expanding human spaceflight into cislunar space. Apollo was a little excursion, but the feed forward from Apollo to today is quite different because the risk regime is different, the technologies are different, the things that we're willing to tolerate in our programs are different, and programs are structured and funded differently than they were in Apollo. So we are now learning how to, developing the capabilities to do this routinely, and we'll learn how to do it routinely, and how to operate routinely within cislunar space. Okay, so far so good. Why are we doing this? We're doing it because NASA is in the explore quadrant, and what they want to do is go explore the solar system. But as I showed you on the chart comparing the space station investment to a lunar surface operations investment, I would argue that this is what we would call a bridge too far. This is a very big gap between even what we'll be doing with the human landing system and a future in which we are actually exploring the solar system. Certainly when you talk about humans exploring Mars, very big gap there. So that's a dilemma. It will remain a dilemma because of the resource requirements and the technological challenges. So what do we do about that? Well, okay, along the way, some other things have happened. So based on the technologies that the nations of the world, the spacefaring nations of the world pioneered, that we now, for the most part, understand and can do variations of, now there has emerged the beginning of a semi-privately funded space passenger travel market. So this comes next. This means more and more investment by private enterprises in systems that will in the future be optimized for adventure travel. Not optimized for exploration, but optimized for this other market. And that then gives our field access to the capital from that market. It gives us new customers, new sources of revenue, therefore new justification for system investments and system developments. This gives us another way to start expanding space activity. In addition, we can take what we've learned from Space Station and Mir and combine it with what we are now doing with commercial passenger travel systems to do passenger travel destination systems. I just shortened it here and called it orbital resort hotels, because that's clearly the biggest market, adventure travel and tourism. That's where all the dollars are for growing that capability. So if you know how to get up and back, and if you know how to build a thing that can sustain activities in orbit, you put those two together, and there ought to be a way that we can now shift those activities from the government realm into the commercial realm. And this is what NASA is trying to do with its so-called LEO commercialization activities, developing, co-developing things to follow Space Station and so forth. We saw earlier this year that even fairly well-established companies are still at risk in this realm. So when COVID hit, Bigelow shuttered his operation, but his team was developing his module technologies based on the Transhab technology that NASA had developed in the first place in the 90s down in the lower part of the map. So government technology investment enables commercial investment and exploitation to access the other markets. Well, now what do you do? Okay, so if we had resort hotels in orbit, even if we did, that we're still not exploring the solar system. So as a space architect, I argue that the other money-bringing quadrant, the exploit quadrant, is key here. And I believe that a modest government investment, less than $1 billion, far less than what it costs to even operate Space Station on an annualized basis, would enable the demonstration of end-to-end provision of clean energy to the surface of the Earth from space. And the point isn't to show a capability that can beat the cost, the kilowatt hour, cost of terrestrial grid power. That's not the point. The point is to prove to the world that it's possible to get unlimited energy for Earth from space. That's never been done. And most people wouldn't believe it. And most people in aerospace don't care because it's not exploring. It's not fun. It's not sexy. It's a lot more mundane than that. There's not really invention in it. All there is connecting the dots of technologies we already understand. But imagine if there was a sign in Times Square that was powered from space. The effect that might have on the world to understand that in a future of increasing conflict over decreasing resources, a world in which increasing industrialization and growing population is ruining our planet, that there's another option that's also not nuclear power. Well, it is nuclear power in the sense that the sun is a big fusion reactor, but there is a way to have unlimited clean power from space for any amount of energy that Earth could conceivably use in our future. And that's never been demonstrated, but it could be demonstrated for a very modest cost with government investment. If that happened, I would suggest, I'd like to argue that could begin to attract the attention of private investors. And then in a hybrid mode, both government and commercial investment in a public-private partnership, the demonstration of scaled up operations could be done. And this would show that you can get kilowatts to megawatts and megawatts to hundreds of megawatts out of space for Earth. Again, this is not out of space for space. This is out of space for Earth. And the energy market on Earth is huge, right? So you begin to see how these other non-space exploration markets could create a demand for an enormous amount of space activity. By the way, most of these space power plants would be very lightweight structures, a lot of robots running around building and maintaining and so forth. But you can't do any of this without some amount of human spaceflight, even if it's only limited to fixing the robots that are actually fixing the hardware. If that happened, then you would be industrializing geostationary orbit or other orbits, medium Earth orbits as well, for power. As I mentioned at the beginning, the geo orbits are already industrialized for telecommunications and for Earth remote sensing and security purposes, but they're not yet industrialized for power. They could be. If that happened, we would then have commercial space passenger travel, commercial destination systems, and would be operating in a commercially based, power-rich environment in space. With that as a foundation, we can do anything we want. We can go explore the solar system, we could settle the moon, we can do both, we can do them in any order you want. So I argue that the way out of the bridge too far at the bottom is to start accessing sources of money that are not government budgets, and that there is a way to do that, which is already happening through adventure travel. And there is another way to do it through the exploitation of space resources, namely photons, and beaming power down to the surface of the Earth. Those two together will then give us the capability to really expand the amount of spaceflight that can occur. So when I put this quote from Yogi Berra at the top, everybody loves Yogi Berra quotes. He says, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. And I like that because it appears to me that there are forks in the road that our governments are not actually recognizing that could be taken. And that brings me to the final point on the first chart, which is that China is investing in space solar power. China's plan for space solar power includes early demonstrations in the 20s, leading to scale-up demonstrations in the 30s, leading to grid power scale industrialization by 2050. So in 2050, I will be 92 years old. I was born the same year as NASA, so I've been watching all this stuff unfold for my whole life. And I see one of the most powerful nations on Earth with a very large population and a very clear vision of its future and the historical context of its future, right? A thousands of years history context. And that government recognizes the value of being the technological nation which brings to Earth unlimited clean power from space. I like to say that whoever develops space solar power will overnight become the world's largest energy exporter. So that then brings me to the first point on my first chart, which is we have choices about what we do in space. We may not feel like we have choices because agencies hand us their agendas. Companies like mine to get access to capital to develop systems follow those directions. We are investing, toward winning the human landing system for NASA because we believe in the moon, we believe in space resources, and we believe that NASA is on the correct path for learning how to put people farther out in space and operate there. But we believe there are other paths that are essential as well. For us to get to a vision where millions of people are living and working in space to benefit Earth, we really need to be thinking very explicitly about what it means to benefit Earth. And there is no shorter path to doing that than bringing the unlimited resources of energy in space directly to Earth for Earth's current and future needs in both the developed and developing worlds as populations increase and as we need to maintain a standard of living and increase the standard of living in the developing world in ways that don't further destroy the ecosystem of the planet. and create more and more conflicts as accessing the remaining resources becomes more and more challenging. So I like to use this picture of Earth to kind of put it in context, and I put it upside down, so to speak, on purpose. So Antarctica is at the top, and then you see Africa and Madagascar. This is what the Earth looks like if you're out in geo that we could industrialize for clean, unlimited power for Earth, and you hold up a soccer ball at arm's length, and the soccer ball looks like this, that's the view of Earth from space. It's that size and it's that beautiful. I would argue that is a worthy destination for us. It is not a planet, so it's not an exploratory destination like the agencies of the world are focused on, but it is a very, very important destination in a future in which spaceflight becomes centrally critical to society going forward. I would like to believe that that's a future that we could collaborate on and that we could develop and show people why space is not just a hobby. It's not just a noble thing about going someplace and examining rocks or returning samples or learning about planetary science. It actually may hold the key to our world saving itself. So with that, I'll stop, and I guess we'll go to some questions.
Thank you, Brent. Very informative, impressive, and thought evocative. Yeah, we have a lot of questions in the chat. Maybe we just start with the first ones, if you like.
Sure. Let's see. I guess I should look at the chat.
Linda, would you like to ask a question yourself?
Yeah, I can do that. Hi.
Hi, Linda.
Hello, Mr. Sherwood. Thank you for your presentation. It was really rich of information, and I totally enjoyed it. The first question during your presentation that popped in my head was about gravity and about it was like a practical question about what are we as architects actually aiming to, like building in space. Of course, it means that we have a perception of architecture as humans, which is known to us on the earthly sector, but is unknown to us, for some of us, of course, which I include myself, unknown as in the planetary section. So how would space, just one second, and the induction of gravity change the perception that we as humans have of architecture?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things to say there, I think. We already know from spaceflight experience so far, we being the collective we, I've not been there either, right? Still working on that part.
That would be awesome, actually, if you would share then that experience with us, and it would be funny that you got back and safe and sound.
Yeah. So, but we already know that our perception of volume changes in space. And so, for example, we can pack a lot more functions into a small volume in space than we can on Earth. Just because we can use all the surfaces, right? And we can reorient ourselves. In fact, Sandy Magnus, astronaut Sandy Magnus, likes to say that most astronauts are not keen on the idea of big volumes in space because you can get stranded in the middle of a big volume. What astronauts like is surfaces that they can grab a hold of to climb around in. That's how they move. And so I think that's cool for normal functions, like if you're trying to prepare a meal or if you're trying to work on something, you know. I also want large volumes because I imagine that there are kinds of sports and other activities for which large volumes will be essential. And I also, as an architect, think that as we get increasing numbers of people, we will have a need for assembly. So, you know, in any hotel, for example, there's a lobby in addition to hotel rooms. So and what is that? It's a space where people can congregate. And if there were like some, I don't know, a newsworthy event, or if there was a cultural event, what would happen? All the people in the hotel would come to the lobby and they would congregate in that one space. Well, we don't know how to do that in space. We don't know how to make a big volume in space yet. So, and that's a technology that NASA does not need to explore. But if we're going to have resort hotels in Earth orbit, we need to figure out, in my view. The other thing I'd say about gravity is on long duration missions, whether in Earth orbit or anywhere else, there is another eternal debate about the need or not for artificial gravity. Because the human body starts adapting to microgravity immediately upon being in free fall, and it adapts very quickly. And there's a whole progression of the changes in your body that happen in the first minutes, the first hours, the first days, the first weeks, and then over succeeding months. But the one thing we know for sure is that it's not great for the human body to adapt to microgravity, and it's really not fun coming back. If you've been in microgravity for a year, coming back to Earth is very, very difficult and takes a long time of rehab to get back to almost normal, never really back to normal. So I personally believe that one of the challenges before we can send a crew to Mars is artificial gravity. If it takes 8 months to get there, and then, oh, by the way, you're going to do a high G entry and landing, you're going to land on the surface, and then you're expected to operate on the surface for a year and a half. And then you're going to fly home for another 6 months. You know, that is really tough. And you don't want to go all the way to Mars and not be able to function right. And there is no real way even to test that until we have something like a mission simulation on station or on Gateway, followed by a lunar surface mission, you know, and all that. The simpler solution is artificial gravity. Engineers have historically avoided incorporating artificial gravity into their mission system designs. My teams back at Boeing in the late 80s and early 90s tackled it, and we think we found reasonable system architecture solutions for artificial gravity for all the different propulsion schemes for Mars missions, but they've never been really developed in detail. And I think artificial gravity is something that we're going to want for destinations in Earth orbit as well. You know, if you went on your honeymoon for a week in space and you were in a resort hotel, yeah, you're going to want to play in microgravity, but you're going to want to play in artificial gravity too, right? Because it's a rotating environment. When you throw a ball, it follows a curved trajectory. The whole experience of being in spinning artificial gravity is yet again different from the experience of being in microgravity, which is different from the experience of being on Earth. And so I think as architects, part of what we do is figure out how to develop the environment within which those experiences can be joyful and productive, rather than just onerous and debilitating.
And just like grasp my curiosity about the artificial gravity. How would that work? Like, and you just mentioned
you have to spin the system. You have to take the system and spin it. So just like on a carnival ride or something, you know, where you're pushed to the outside, if you're in a vehicle which is spinning and you're against the outside wall.
Oh, I get that.
Like,
right. Yeah, I got it. It's just a simulation of the gravity, like the microgravity, right? And how long would it approximately? I'm not going to bother you any longer with the question, but just how long would it take the rehabilitation after you came back from space? Like, because
so there's that's easy to find. So astronaut Mark Kelly, you know, there was this twin study where his twin brother stayed on Earth and he was on space station for a year. And they did all kinds of biomedical comparisons of them, which is where a lot of our knowledge has come. There have also been a couple of Russian astronauts who've spent more than a year on orbit. And the rehabilitation it's just like after any major accident or surgery, it's physical therapy, days on end for months to regain strength and so forth, because you don't use your legs in space. Your spine stretches, you don't use your legs, your muscles atrophy, your heart expands and rises up in your chest, the fluids all get redistributed. So it takes your body as long to get back to almost normal as it did to get into that modified state in the first place.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Sherwood. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you, Brent. Linda, you will have the possibility to talk with 2 astronauts very soon. They will.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. That's a great opportunity. Thank you.
Let's go to the question of Felix. Felix, are you ready?
Yes, I am. But I think I posted like 6 questions in total. Should I do all of them?
Ask your favorite one first, Felix.
Okay, my favorite one first. Let's see, what did I ask? Yeah, one of them is you talked about us needing around 60 necessary technologies for going to Mars. Could you just talk about what these might be, like the most important ones?
Sure. Sure. So the first thing to say is everybody has their own favorite list. The list we were working with at NASA in 2010, I think, had 72 items on it. And you know, when you compare people's lists, then you very rapidly get into system architecture arguments where somebody says, oh, well, this is an essential technology. And I'm like, well, only for your architecture. My architecture doesn't need that technology, so I don't care. And so, but all of these lists have somewhere between 50 and 70, more or less. So the one we were just talking about is one that people will argue over. I personally believe artificial gravity is essential for Mars class missions. The current NASA design reference mission for human Mars missions does not require artificial gravity. But one that it does require is you have to be able to, well, let me say it a different way. With current technology, we can land about a ton on the surface of Mars. That's what we do when at JPL, you know, we fly big rovers to Mars. So they weigh about a ton. That's sitting on the surface without all the transportation stuff, the aeroshells and heat shields and all the parachutes and all the stuff that got them there. When it's sitting on the surface, it's about a ton. So we know how to do that. But here's an interesting thing. We don't know how to do it in the southern hemisphere of Mars. We can only do it in the north. Why is that? It's because Mars is a very gravitationally uneven planet. It's a very topographically lumpy planet. The southern hemisphere is all highlands. The northern hemisphere is all lowlands. Because they're lowlands in the north, the thin atmosphere of Mars has enough column height to get enough density that the parachutes that we have qualified for these heavy payloads work, and you can take out all the energy with the heat shield and parachutes or retro rockets and all these capabilities that we use, airbags and for the smaller rovers, you know, all of these technologies, we can get all the energy out down to the surface. In the southern hemisphere, there's not enough atmosphere above you to do that. And so we do not have a system that can land even the rovers that we fly today in the southern hemisphere. So half of Mars is inaccessible to us. In addition, we can't land, we don't know how to land, well, we know how, but we haven't demonstrated landing payloads that are 10 or 20 times as heavy as the rovers we send today. And that's required if you're going to send human systems, because human systems are big and heavy, right? So we know how we have to do it, which is what's called supersonic retropropulsion, up until Blue Origin started flying New Shepard, and then SpaceX started flying Falcon boosters back, and now does so routinely, supersonic retropropulsion had never been done. And there were whole big arguments in the propulsion community that said, well, if you're coming in at hypersonic speeds, you can't turn on a rocket engine because the flow field will blow the plume back up into the nozzle, and either the engine won't ignite or the engine will explode or it won't work. And now we know it does work. Okay, so that's an example of a huge technology that even just 10 years ago, there were very credible engineers who didn't even believe was possible. But
Okay,
now
so
it's been done on
technologies
Earth.
Actually are possible now.
Wait, say it again.
Some of these technologies from this list are actually possible now.
Some, yeah,
Oh.
but there are many others. The finishing thought on supersonic retropropulsion is we've never done it at scale at Mars, right? So there's still a road ahead of us there. But there are other things like, you know, one of the things that breaks all the time on space station is what's called the CDRA, the carbon dioxide removal assembly. So on short flights, the technology that's used is lithium hydroxide canisters to absorb the carbon dioxide, and that's what people do on submarines, and it's done on short space flights. For a longer flight, like space station, you need something that actually chemically removes the carbon dioxide, and you want to recycle the oxygen back into the breathing air. That's a very complicated rack of equipment. And NASA has been developing, and I think next year will send up to station the new generation of technology for that. When you open up the hood on one of these things and look at it, it's all little tubes and valves and filters, and it's all controlled by microprocessors. And so no wonder it breaks down, right? If you're going to go to Mars on a 3-year mission, it better not be breaking down, right? We don't yet know how to do that. I'm sorry?
Is space exploration or space missions, is there room for, or is there probably cargo room for just building redundancy? Or is that a luxury that you can't afford?
Yes, I mean, you know, there's a lot of engineering work that goes into the calculation of which spares are the right spares to take. But you also have to design all the systems to be spareable, you know, meaning repairable. And then the crew on board have to either know or be able to learn how to repair every single thing on the ship, right? And so that's where a lot of the money and the time go, right? Because figuring all this out is hard. And then on station, it's relatively straightforward to bring up a new item. On a 3.5-year mission to and from Mars, you can't do that. So, but I'll give you another one that is just almost utterly unknown, and that is what to do about Mars dust.
Yeah.
So, you know, we know from the Phoenix mission that Mars dust has perchlorate in it, which is quite toxic. So we don't know how reliably to keep dust out of the cabin atmosphere when a crew goes on EVA, for example, and then they come back in through the airlock. And there's issues with the seals of the airlock. There's issues with dust getting into equipment. There's issues then with the dust getting inhaled, or, you know, whatever other effects it might have. These are all things we don't know. And they're hard to simulate on Earth because you can make simulants of Mars regolith, but not chemically identical to what we know about Mars soil. And oh, by the way, we don't actually have any Mars soil on Earth, right? All we have is the results of scientific exploration missions like the rovers. So then we can sort of piece together the story. But if your life is gonna depend on a system which is resistant or can manage Mars dust for 1.5 years on the surface, okay, on the one hand, you can say, well, it's just engineering. You know, we would put in seals and systems to clean and monitoring and, chemical testing. And okay, that's all fine. That's all technology that needs to be developed. So there's lots and lots of examples in life support, in equipment, in operating in the native conditions of Mars, very cold temperature extremes, radiation, the toxic soil chemistry, So the dust is a good example of how learning stuff on the moon is going to help, because moon dust is different. It's toxic in different ways because of its the size of the particles. We believe from studying Apollo samples that that lunar dust is very bad to inhale, and you don't want it in your equipment, and it's a nuisance on EVA as well. It gets on everything and it sticks to everything, and it's highly abrasive, and because the surface of the moon's been pulverized by meteoroids for billions of years. So you have all these little glassy, sharp, microscopic pieces of stuff, right? That it's just miserable to deal with. But it's just engineering, right? So once we learn how to engineer our way around that for habitable systems and other systems on the moon, now that puts us a big step forward for imagining how to do that at Mars and designing how to do that at Mars. So I think a lot of the, for the big list of technologies includes big things for transportation in space, big things for system maintenance in space and reliability, big things for what we call the human system. That's all the ways that, the equipment and sort of the integration of a human into the system. And then surface, getting to the surface, operating on the surface, ascending back from the surface. All of those things done at scale for those kind of missions are new. They're all new technologies.
Thank you. One more question I have that I ran into, an issue that I ran into quite often, is when I share my enthusiasm of space with people, I oftentimes hear that we have so many problems on Earth. Why should we spend any resources on exploring anything outside of Earth? That's just decadent and unnecessary and a waste of resources. If we could use those resources on fixing our problems on Earth, what do you tell to people like that?
Sure. Well, first, I'm curious, what do you tell them when you hear this?
Well, I tell them that we as a species have only come to where we are right now because of our curiosity, and it's just built into our nature, and it's what brought us where we are. And that if you think of like another example where you probably hear this argument a lot, is you talk about problems like CERN, about quantum experiments and stuff. And then I tell people, did you know that we only have the internet because of CERN, which is like an offsprout of the byproduct of it. So that's my two main arguments that I have. So
okay,
what do you have?
Well, so I've heard this, of course, a lot myself. We all do. And I think, in my view, there are several dimensions to an answer. It's like a gemstone. It has multiple facets, and they're all connected, and they're all beautiful. They all have value. So one is, I would observe that we are living in a time of exponential development of both capabilities and problems. So the rate of change in modern society is significantly different from what the rate of change was when I was a child, or when my grandparents were kids, or a century and a half ago. The rate of progress is accelerating. And that means that even practically before you blink, you'll have more problems than you can deal with. The wrong approach to dealing with the technologically induced problems of the modern world, The wrong approach would be to retreat from advancing technology, right? You can only solve those problems by getting technologically more and more savvy, because only then could you have both the tools and possibly the wisdom to solve these problems that are outrunning our ability. A second thing I would say is, if you wait until you've solved all your problems before you do anything new, you will never do anything new, because the backlog of problems to solve is it exceeds any capacity to fix them all. It would be a mirage to think we're going to make the world perfect and then we can go do all these other things. That's not human nature, and it's not the nature of the world. Then a fourth one I use is, as you could imagine, I try to introduce people to the value that space can provide directly for Earth, like in the form of solar power, because I think most people equate space activities with exploring planets, and they don't realize or think that there are other things to do with space that might be very, very useful, and in fact might be pivotal in fixing a lot of these problems, like no access to clean water, and insufficient energy for agriculture and providing food for people, and all those kinds of things. Energy is at the root of our ability to solve many, many material problems on Earth. And then finally, I would say that, or I do say that, when times are maybe especially bad, which it seems like that happens all the time and they only get worse, but especially this year during pandemic, you hear this argument. It's like, well, how can you even talk about landing on the moon when there's a pandemic? And my response to that is, the world needs hope now more than it ever has. This is exactly when we need hope. And those of us in the space business are about building hope for the future. That's what we do. We're building the future. So if you're not building the future, well, then maybe you can't expect the future to be better than it is.
Thank you, Brent. Felix, sorry, we have to move to the next questions. We have a question on the future society. Before I let Valentina ask her question, we have one from our David Wong via the YouTube talk, and he asks, in the past, human spaceflight development has been heavily influenced by geopolitics. Do you consider these to remain as primary drivers, or to be taken over by commercial interests in the near future?
Thanks, David, for that. That's a fantastic question. I do expect geopolitics to continue always to play a role. Where we see it, I would say there are three areas where that I would point to. One is, it's very clear from the positive example of excuse me, I've been talking a lot. It's evident from the very positive example of the International Space Station that international collaboration can drive system requirements and capability. And although it made the space station program very slow to develop, it made a robust program, was able to survive political decision-making, and it got built. And it is just remarkable that even though on Earth, we may have governments that pick at each other, up in space, the crews from those governments work together and they're friends. And that to me is just an incredibly hopeful sign. Second, though, we in the US have restrictions imposed by Congress on our ability to work with China. And that is a geopolitical limitation. It's not going to stop China from doing what they're doing. And so we're on the cusp of a decade and future decades of kind of two types of systems in space, one in which the community of nations we're already familiar with is working together, and another in which that community of nations, except the United States, is working together with China. I would like to hope that at some point in the future, those communities can become one. I do not see it being a short-term step forward by the U.S. government, because the kind of political aversion to enabling or working with China is so high right now. The third thing I'd say is, in a world in which you can provide power to anywhere on the planet from space, it really starts to denationalize activity even further. And there's a chart I normally include in talks about space solar power and in some of my papers that I call the political geography of space solar power. If you take all of the power using cities on Earth and project them up to the geostationary orbit, you get to see who are neighbors in longitude. They may not be neighbors in latitude on Earth, but they're neighbors in longitude around the Earth. And so you'll see, for example, San Salvador is right next to Chicago in geo. Jerusalem is right next to Moscow in geo. And so although you can see kind of regional groupings, some of those regional groupings are remarkable from the standpoint of showing how one power source in space can supply the power needs of very different cultures on Earth. And so I think that may provide some hope, well, maybe some fear, but also some hope about how the geopolitics can be, space can make geopolitics different than what we have seen so far on Earth today. Another interesting part of your question is the second part. I do think that the emergence of transnational corporations has dramatically changed the impact that geopolitics has. And I think that was really the root of your question. So when you have a company like, I'm on a Mac, so I'll just say a company like Apple, for example, whose products are used throughout the world, that is a type of influence. That's a technical and economic and maybe cultural influence that has nothing to do with geopolitics. And the more the world gets integrated and sort of culturally homogenized and technologically homogenized, I think the greater the possibility for transnational corporations to have increasing amounts of influence relative to governments.
Thank you, Brent. Valentina, do you still have an open question on that topic?
Yes, I would like to ask a question. So, just generally speaking, since we're facing the new extreme conditions, we are in the need to rethink the way we design as architects, so we could create a sustainable environment. And since the new environment will be a crucial parameter which will shape our future society, I was just wondering, what are your general visions about the new space society, and which differences can we encounter compared to the Earth society we have nowadays?
That's a great question. That's the kind of question that architects like, because it gets right to human behavior. And so one of the things that I find both compelling to think about, but also perplexing to imagine working through, is the connection between human behavior and societal safety. So, you know, if you go to an extreme environment on Earth, like let's say you're in a submarine, so it can be easy for one person's actions to put everyone at risk. We don't see that as much in urban environments and, you know, terrestrial environments, because we can breathe the air and we can mostly drink the water, and, you know, so we can move about without constant fixation on safe behavior. But in extreme environments, you can't do that. And so most of these environments have very regimented operations protocols, whether they're scientific expeditions or whether they're military crews. There are procedures, and the procedures are integrated very tightly with the system designs, the system operations and system behaviors, so that they can be controlled. So they're predictable, and so that accidents don't happen. So in space, you know, as one of the most lethal environments that we have, not just a hostile environment, but a lethal environment, the need to operate according to safety all the time without fail is paramount. So that starts to say things about the nature of people in human communities living in space, right? The ways that they will have to be able to trust each other, to do only right things and never do a wrong thing. And then that has implications as the populations in space start to shift from professionally trained crews on a mission to, I would call it, controlled populations of travelers, to eventually a time when it's families raising kids. You know, I guess I would say the science fiction literature is full of examples of societies living in space where there was a bad actor who did something bad. And, you know, we see that on Earth today, and with urban unrest and in the US, you know, mass shootings and so forth, where one person can make a bad day for a lot of people. Well, if you have a resort hotel in Earth orbit and it's got hundreds of people in it, staff and guests and so forth, that's almost like a kind of Poseidon adventure movie waiting to happen, right? And so how we design systems to be robust against that, and how we manage expectations of the human populations to protect against that, is all work for the future. There's a matrix I show sometimes that I normally use it with space architect groups to show how little we actually know. And I use it to try to say a positive thing, which is you can think about surviving, you can think about psychological health, and you can think about sociological health. So there's a scale there. And then on the other dimension, you can think about professionally trained crews, travelers who are well managed, and then settlers. And in that matrix, we know a lot about mission crews and surviving. We know a little bit about mission crews and psychology. We know absolutely nothing about any of the other squares in the matrix. And so that's the job for space architects, is to figure that out. So with that, Sandra, I'm afraid I have to hop onto another meeting, so I'm going to need to exit. But I appreciate the time and you know, meeting your class and others, and hopefully maybe I've been able to provoke some stimulating thoughts, and you guys can do great work.
Thank you very much, Brent. Have a good day.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Thank you.